Hi, I'm Mr. Crompton, and today I'm going to show you safety for the compound miter saw. This saw is used for cutting angles in a piece of wood. You can either rotate to cut an angle in this direction right here, or you can actually rotate the machine on an angle, and that would be why it would be a compound, because you could cut two angles at once. What this machine is used for is either cutting an angle like I just said, or it can cut straight across a piece of wood. The first thing you're going to want to do when you walk over to this machine is you have to unlock it so that it will rise up and you can actually use the piece of equipment. To do that, you actually, on the back side of it, over in the back over here, there's a little button that you actually remove or pull out to release the saw. So you push down on the handle, pull out on this button, and the saw will come up, and now it's ready to use. So the first thing that you see about this saw is that there is a giant guard over the blade. This guard is actually really nice because when you lower the saw down into the material, the guard will actually spin so that it clears the bottom for the blade to allow it to cut, while still protecting you from the blade as it goes down. So it's actually a pretty unique guard. Other parts of the machine would be obviously the blade on the inside. That's a standard circular saw blade, and this is a particular blade that's best for cross cutting, which is cutting across the grain. There is the table right here and the fence, and as I showed you, there is an adjustment to adjust the angle on the table itself, which will turn the blade to allow it to cut for any angle that you want to go between 0 and usually 40 to 50 degrees. So to use this piece of equipment, what you're going to want to do is you take your piece of wood and then you make a mark on it to have some sort of a measurement for where you need a cut. So if I needed a cut and I wanted that cut to be about 8 inches, I can come over here, use my tape measure, and make a mark on my piece of wood at 8 inches. Then I can use a square if I choose to do this, which will allow me to line the blade up a little bit better, and I can draw a line the whole way across the piece of wood. So now I know where my blade needs to cut on this piece of material. Now when you cut with this saw, you need to keep in mind that that cut needs to be entirely on the scrap side of the wood. And what I mean by that is you want to cut on the side of the wood that is not your finished part. So on this particular piece of wood, our scrap side is going to be on our left. I will actually draw a little X on there so that I know that I line the blade up entirely on that side of the line. So now I'm going to line the wood up on the table, making sure that it's up against the fence on the back. It's very important that the wood stays up against the fence on the back. If you try to cut this piece of wood leaning forward away from the fence, there's a good chance that the blade's going to grip into the piece of wood and rip it towards the fence in a very violent motion. Generally just rips it out of your hand, but it could fling your hands over into the blade. You don't want that to happen. So I'm going to slide that all the way up against the fence, and then I can lower my blade entirely onto the scrap side of the line. Once I'm sure that I'm good, the next thing I need to do is cut. When I cut with this saw, there's a few things you need to keep in mind. Number one, you need to keep your thumb and your hand that you're holding the wood with away from the blade. So you want to keep it at least 4 inches away from the blade here. It's a pretty dangerous piece of equipment. If it was to come in contact with your finger, it would rip it clean off. So I'm going to hold it out here somewhere. The next thing I want to do is I take my thumb and I tuck it and have it sticking forward underneath of my fingers so that it is not sticking out in an L shape. That's a pretty dangerous thing to do because if you don't pay attention, you can have your thumb sticking straight over where the blade is and you could cut it off, and that would be a bad call. So I'm going to stick my thumb and tuck it underneath of my hand. That way it's safe and away from the blade. Then I can just hold this with my right hand, hold the wood with your left hand, and you squeeze the trigger and lower it down through the piece of wood. So I'll show you that right now. Once you're through the piece of wood, you let that blade come to a complete stop on this machine before you raise it back up. If I raise it back up too soon, it can actually ting off the side of that piece of wood and rip it out. It'll rip a tooth off the saw blade. It does all kinds of weird stuff. Another thing you'll notice that I let the saw reach full speed before I cut down through. You want to make sure that you do that. Some people try to start the saw on the piece of wood, and if you do that, it'll actually bite the teeth into the piece of wood and it can fry the brushes on the motor, which will ruin the machine. So, and other than that, that was a pretty safe way that I cut that piece of wood. Now you can also cut angles with this, like I said. So I can do the same thing and just spin it over at 45 degrees. And now if I have to fit two pieces together and make a 90-degree turn on a piece of wood, I can just cut it in the same way. And now I'll actually have an angled cut in my piece of wood. So other than that, there's not a whole lot to do with this machine. It's a fairly safe machine. It's a fairly simple machine. Just make sure you keep your fingers away from the blade and you keep the material up against the fence and up against the table.